If you think Highguard looks unacceptably blurry, even when you've set it to native rendering resolution, 100% of your monitor's resolution, that's because the game is lying to you. It is not actually running at 100% of your rendering resolution unless you set post-processing quality to 100%. But wait, not 100%. High. For some reason, post-processing quality in this game changes the output resolution, not the internal rendering resolution, although I guess indirectly, but literally it's like going up here to resolution and changing to a non-native resolution for your monitor. I'm not kidding, I can prove it. If post-processing quality is set to low, then this game is actually rendering at 864p, even though I have it set to 1080p. And similar effects happen for other resolutions. I can see it right here. Now, what is this that I'm using to measure this? This is a overlay that you can enable through a registry edit that lets DLSS show its internal rendering resolution as well as its target output resolution, which should match what the game is set to here, 1080p. But the crazy thing is, if I set post-processing quality to high, guess what? Not only do things look a lot sharper now, although I'd argue this game still looks blurrier than it should, it looks a lot better and performance is a lot worse. But look, 1080p internal, 1080p output. We've fixed it. Now, I don't want to take credit as if I discovered this issue for myself. I received an email from a viewer the second this game was out, asking me to test this out. And then I also searched online to see if other people were noticing this issue. And there's posts like here on the Steam community, scummy devs faking the in-game resolution. Now, I hope that this is a bug that was unintended by the developers rather than trying to fake that the game's running at better performance than it actually is. But here it also outlines the registry edit that you can use to enable that overlay. Now, I should always warn people that, modifying your registry can cause problems with your PC. There is a way to disable this setting with this registry edit as well. You can just alter that. You can open up a notepad file. I mean, I'm not going to teach you how to do the registry edit here. Like, you can Google search how to do a registry edit. The point is that's how we're looking at the internal rendering resolution for the game. Now, where I keyed into the post-processing issue is I actually just found it when I was reading the comments here, which is just FYI, the internal resolution is 80% when post-processing is set to low, set it to high for 100%. So this is really, really strange. Again, the post-processing quality is affecting the output resolution. So again, right now, the game is rendering full native 1080p right here. 1080p internal, 1080p output. By the way, we're hitting about 65 FPS. Now, if I change the post-processing quality back to low, by the way, here's another bug. So this says I should be able to press enter to apply settings. You can't. Well, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It's weird. I think I have to double click enter. Now, if you're having issues getting settings to apply, because I definitely was, if I just hit enter once, okay, now it's working. It's weird. It wasn't working for me earlier. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I have noticed you can click the apply manually with your mouse if you're having issues getting it to apply. Anyway, so what I'm noticing is that now we're at 864p internally to an 864 output, and our frame rate has jumped all the way up to 84 frames per second. Again, far beyond the performance impact that changing post-processing effects should have. So there's some weird thing going on here, and sure enough, if we go to the medium post-processing quality, it actually changes the rendering resolution again, this time to 972p. Now, again, the reason why this is a really big problem is because it is completely fine to have resolution scaling, but that's what this internal resolution slider is for. That should not be controlled by your post-processing quality. Also, here's the other really important thing. You want the output resolution to be the monitor's native resolution for things not to look unacceptably blurry. So that's where we have it here. So now, if I want to resolution scale the game, I could now lower the internal resolution with the slider. Let's go to maybe 67%, 66%. That's generally like DLSS quality. Because notice this game doesn't have DLSS quality or performance or balanced. You just use the resolution slider. But now notice it's working properly. The internal rendering resolution has been lowered, but notice that the output resolution is a proper 1080p. So the upscaling algorithm is actually trying to reconstruct a 1080p image instead of a below 1080p image on a 1080p display, which causes it to look blurry. So that is a pretty major issue with the game. Now, notice that if I do have the internal rendering resolution set to, let's go down to 50% to make things simple. So if I set it to 50%, so that's the equivalent of DLSS performance mode. So this should be a 540p internal rendering resolution to a 1080p output. Notice this is reporting 965 by 543, outputting to a 1080. But notice that when I adjust the post-processing effects, down to low, for example, it adjusts to where it's now doing 50% of this resolution. So now we're doing 772 by 434, outputting to 1536 by 864. So again, it looks significantly worse on the 1080p display because the DLSS algorithm is not only coming from a lower resolution, but it's coming from but it's targeting a non-native monitor resolution, and it looks just gross compared to actually targeting the native output resolution, even when you're in DLSS performance mode. 540p to a 1080p output doesn't look amazing, but this looks a lot crisper and easier to work with and actually play the game than it does with that incorrect output resolution. Now, I can't directly confirm that the game's TSR option has the same issue, although I suspect that it does. Now, one reason is based on performance. So if I'm staring here, this is the actual 1080p output, right? So we're at the 100% actual 100% resolution. If I switch this over to TSR and actually apply that, notice that we're at a similar level of overall performance as what we were getting from DLSS. And that's kind of the general idea here. So in other words, I'm pretty sure TSR is having the same problem, but I can't use the DLSS internal resolution indicator to actually show you the numbers. Does that make sense? So I can't give you the overlay. So here, what we're looking at is TSR set to 100%. So this is native 1080p, post-processing quality at high. We're hitting 69, nice, FPS. Now, if I go ahead and adjust the post-processing quality, let's see if we get that abnormally large performance boost, but also abnormally blurry image. And sure enough, very blurry looking image, and we're up to 92 frames per second. That is a very large performance boost and a very large hit to image quality just for adjusting post-processing effects. So the eye test tells me this is not targeting native 1080p, and the performance numbers also tell me that this is not targeting native 1080p. So, long story short, if you want the game to not look like a disgustingly blurry mess, set post-processing quality to high. But that does mean that the game is going to run significantly slower because it's actually rendering at a higher resolution now. So instead, if you need to gain back some of that performance, do it with the internal rendering resolution slider instead of the post-processing effects slider. Because now, even if you run at an insanely low internal rendering resolution, it's actually going to try to make it look like your monitor's native resolution, which will be less blurry even when going to low numbers. However, one other issue I've noticed with this game is it can be CPU limited. Right now I'm testing on an intentionally mid-range system that's actually really close to the game's recommended system. So the recommended system is a RTX 2080, and a Ryzen 5 3600 or an i5 9600K. The AMD GPU is an RX 6650 XT. Now, I don't have an RTX 2080, but I do have an RTX 3060, which is, within about 10% of the performance of the two recommended GPUs. So we're really close to the recommended GPU, and I actually have more VRAM, so that won't be an issue. But also, a good reason I test out the RTX 3060 is the most popular GPU on the Steam hardware survey. So it's a very common GPU. It's very close to the recommended GPU for the game. Also, I'm actually above the recommended CPU for the game, which is a Ryzen 5 3600. I'm on a Ryzen 5 5600X in this video. Now again, I have any system I want. We could be on a 5090 with the 9800X 3D. That's not the point. I'm not just like somebody with a low-end system complaining. I'm trying to test out a system that's close to, and in some ways a little bit above, at least on the CPU side, the recommended specs for the game. And remember, this is a competitive multiplayer shooter. And one thing I want you to notice right now is we are not GPU limited. We're actually CPU limited. I can spot that by the GPU usage percentage. We're at 80-something%. If we were GPU limited, this would be closer to 99%. Now, why does that matter? What matters is that there's not really anything I can do to get a lot higher performance than this on my CPU. We're just kind of stuck. And right now I'm in a match where I am by myself running around an empty map. I actually played some multiplayer games to look at what the performance looked like in combat. This game's only 3v3, but even when you're in a 3v3 raid, when you're in a base with all the players present, the Ryzen 5 5600X was dropping well below 60 FPS, and that's when you're in a big battle. That's when the performance matters the most. And if you're still not believing me that it's CPU limited at these kinds of frame rates, check this out. So we can continue to reduce the internal rendering resolution of the game. We're going to go all the way down to 10%. That's per axis. So we're going to be at an absurdly low resolution right now. Do you notice that the performance has not increased? We're still hanging out at around 90 to 100 FPS. In other words, the GPU is doing very little right now. We're at 50% utilization. We are absolutely limited by the rest of the system, which we usually just say is kind of CPU limited. Now, no core in particular is reporting like 100% usage, so it feels a little bit weird here. But the point is, we're not GPU limited. This is limited somewhere else on the system that's usually the CPU, and we're still only hanging out at around 100 FPS on a completely empty single-player map. If we go into a multiplayer match, even with these absurdly blurry settings, the GPU is going to be asleep, but the actual performance is going to be terrible. So I should probably finish up the video here, but maybe just to emphasize my point, we could actually get into a multiplayer game. Now, the multiplayer, though, is not going to be as demanding at the start, because at first you only have the 3 players on your team in the same area. But like I said, when it gets into 3v3, things get even worse. So what I'm showing you right now is how CPU limited this game can be. So if you're feeling like your performance is low, it's especially in combat, especially if you look at your GPU usage percentage and it's not around 99%, there's a very good chance that you are CPU limited. And unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do settings-wise, even turning everything down to low. Although again, be careful what settings you turn down to low. You don't want to turn your post-processing effects to low, because then that makes the game look terrible. I mean, obviously my game's looking absurdly comically terrible right now, but that's just because we're proving a point about the CPU limited nature of the game if we actually get to that point. And again, remember, the settings we're at here are mostly medium and low, so it's pretty dang low from a settings perspective. So overall, I have a lot of issues with that performance of the game. And this being Unreal Engine 5, there's a lot of games that are kind of weirdly CPU limited, and that kind of seems to be the case here. So the post-processing, changing the monitor output resolution is my main problem with the game, but the the fact that I can have the graphics settings look like this when there's 3 players in the area, and notice that now we're down into the 80s. Again, when you bring the additional players from the enemy team into this area, things are going to get a whole heck of a lot worse. So that's what I've got for you guys today. I will shut off the recording now, just because we're definitely not going to play out a whole match here. I was just proving a little point on the CPU performance, despite setting the GPU to 10% rendering resolution. Like I said, it gets worse when we get to 3v3, but I'd have to play through like the whole match to get to that point. Anyway, I hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope you all have an excellent day.